In May 2023, the Spanish police receive an alarming call from a quiet neighborhood in Malaga. In one of the apartments, the body of a young woman with multiple stab wounds is discovered. The suspect in the crime disappears, but after a few hours, he is calmly found in a local cafe, drinking coffee as if nothing had happened. However, this tragedy becomes just the beginning of a chain of events that lead investigators to a 9-year-old case. Behind the wall of one of the apartments is something so shocking that even experienced forensic experts could not believe their eyes. In 2011, Sibora Gagani lived with her boyfriend Marco in Spain in the Laurel area. At first glance, their life seemed stable. Sibora got a job as a waitress in a local restaurant, and Marco worked as a cook. They rented a small house, and Sibora regularly called her mother Elisabetta, assuring her that everything was fine. However, behind this picture of outward well-being, serious problems were hiding, which became more obvious with each passing month. When Elisabetta came to Spain to visit her daughter, she immediately noticed the tense atmosphere in the house. Arguments between Sibora and Marco occurred even in her presence. Elisabetta saw how her daughter tried to justify his outbursts of jealousy and tension, citing temporary difficulties. However, the mother was sure that it was not only about everyday problems. It was hard to believe that just 2 years ago, Sibora was a completely different person. Born on September 14, 1991 in Tirana, Albania, from childhood she stood out for her cheerful character. After her parents' divorce, her mother Elisabetta moved with the children to Italy, where they began a new life. In Rome, Sibora quickly won the affection of those around her. Her nickname, Chibi, given by classmates, emphasized her energy and friendliness. Despite financial difficulties, Sibora sought to help the family from an early age. She got a job as a waitress in a local restaurant, but did not abandon her dream. Her natural beauty, slender figure, and victories in a regional beauty contest opened the way for her into the world of fashion. However, despite her successes, her main dream remained to work as a teacher because Sibora sincerely loved children. Changes began when Sibora turned 18. In one of the cafes, she met Marco, a 30-year-old man whose charm and confidence immediately attracted her. At the time of their acquaintance, Sibora knew little about him. He was divorced, had a sister, and, as it seemed, wanted to start a new life. However, behind this appearance hid his complicated past. Marco was known for his aggressive character and problems with illegal drugs, which more than once brought him to the attention of the police. Sibora, enchanted by his charisma, did not pay attention to this. A year into their relationship, Marco suggested that Sibora move to Spain, claiming that there were not enough job opportunities in Italy. Elisabetta tried to dissuade her daughter, doubting the sincerity of Marco's intentions, but Sibora insisted. It seemed to her that this step would be the beginning of a new chapter, where she and Marco could build a happy life. In Spain, their first period looked promising. Sibora quickly found a job as a waitress, and Marco got a job at Pizzillo. They rented a cozy house, and Sibora told her mother about her plans. However, the stability was short-lived. Marco began to lose one job after another, blaming it on his employers. His irritability and jealousy became more and more noticeable. He increasingly exhibited his aggressive behavior in little things, which gradually grew into serious conflicts. Elisabetta, who came to Spain to personally see how her daughter was living, was shocked by what she saw. Sibora, who had always been cheerful and confident, now looked depressed. Marco did not hide his irritability even in the presence of her mother. Arguments became louder, and Sibora, despite obvious problems, continued to defend Marco, assuring that everything would work out. What exactly made Sibora ignore the alarming signs was a mystery to those close to her. Perhaps she was looking to Marco for the support and stability she lacked in her youth. The family, having moved from Albania to Italy, went through difficult times. Elisabetta worked hard to give her children a chance at a better life. But Sibora faced the need to take responsibility early on. Perhaps her relationship with Marco was an attempt to fill that void, but instead, it led to even more tension. In July 2014, Sibora Gagani suddenly disappeared, leaving her family worried. The last time she exchanged a message with Marco, her former partner, was on July 7th, after which her phone was turned off and all social networks froze. This was strange and uncharacteristic behavior for her. Prior to this, Sibora had told her mother that she had finally broken off her relationship with Marco, moved to a new apartment, and felt free. She even described her feeling as if she were a butterfly that had just emerged from a cocoon. However, her sudden silence alarmed everyone. The situation began to take an even stranger turn when Marco suddenly appeared at her mother's house in Italy. He tried to give the impression of a concerned person, regretting what had happened. Over a cup of coffee, he told Elisabetta that he himself did not understand where Sibora could have gone. According to him, before her disappearance, they had a fight and she left, leaving all her things behind. Later, he changed his version, claiming that the guard of their residential complex allegedly saw Sibora leaving with 2 suitcases. These contradictory statements raised doubts and increased anxiety. Elisabetta recalled that a month before, Sibora had told her about her decision to end this relationship. After 3 years of trying to save it, she moved out from Marco and began to arrange her life anew. Sibora tried to stay away from her former partner, but apparently this did not stop him. Marco continued to show an active interest in her life. Back in early July, he unexpectedly called Elisabetta, asking if Sibora had returned to Italy. This question seemed strange, especially against the backdrop of their breakup. Sibora had repeatedly made attempts to break ties with Marco. In 2013, she even returned home to her mother in Italy, deciding to leave everything behind. Then, she admitted that she no longer saw the point in the relationship. However, Marco did not back down. He appeared at their house, assuring Sibora that he would change and even propose to her. Sibora, tired of fighting at that time, again succumbed to his promises. But soon everything was repeated. Jealousy, control, and violence again began to destroy her life. Once she confessed to her mother that if she decided to leave for good, she would literally have to disappear. Otherwise, Marco would not leave her alone. In the following months, Sibora came to Italy more and more often, presumably due to the expiration of her residence permit in Spain. Elisabetta noticed that her daughter looked increasingly frightened, but Sibora rarely shared details. She only said that she was trying to find a way out of the situation. By June 2014, Sibora had moved to a new apartment, trying to start from scratch. She told her mother that she was no longer going to return to Marco. For a short period, this gave her a sense of freedom, but anxiety for her safety remained. When Marco claimed that Sibora had left, leaving all her things behind, her family immediately realized that this was not like her. She would never sever ties with her loved ones, especially with her mother and brothers. Now the family was left in a state of waiting. They hoped that Sibora had indeed decided to hide in order to finally get rid of Marco's control. However, contradictory versions of events and the lack of any news from her raised more and more questions. In 2015, the investigation into Sibora Gagani's disappearance still had not yielded results, despite the efforts of her family and the police. Elisabetta, her mother, was the initiator of an official appeal to law enforcement. She insisted that Marco, Sibora's former partner, could be involved in her disappearance. as he was the last one to see her before she went missing. However, his behavior raised more and more questions. During interrogation, Marco repeated his version. Sibora had allegedly left the house after a quarrel, taking only a few things with her. However, her personal belongings, including clothes and documents, remained in the house, which seemed strange. Despite his statement, Marco did not report her disappearance to the police. He assured that he tried to find Sibora on his own, printing ads and hanging them up in the area where they lived. Moreover, he put forward different assumptions about her whereabouts. Either she could have gone to Argentina, or she was seen with an unknown man, with whom there was allegedly a conflict. However, these statements turned out to be contradictory and were not confirmed by facts. Elisabetta, not trusting Marco, made her own efforts to find her daughter. She turned to the media and a special organization that disseminated information about missing persons. Publications with photos of Sibora and calls for help began to appear in Italian and Spanish news. Despite this, no new traces were found. While Sibora's family continued the struggle to find out her fate, Marco led a life that looked ordinary to outsiders. He changed his appearance, shaving his hair and growing a beard. He tried not to attract unnecessary attention to himself, but his behavior left questions. During this period, he started new relationships, but both romances ended with women complaining about his aggression. Despite this, he continued to live in Spain, regularly visiting the gym and signing up for a shooting club, which alarmed those who were familiar with his past. Sibora's family did not stop searching. Elisabetta repeatedly appealed to the police with requests to intensify the investigation. In parallel, law enforcement officers began to review the case materials in order to find new leads. They checked Marco's testimony, which from the very beginning looked inconsistent. The statement that Sibora left with suitcases contradicted his words that she allegedly left the house without things. It also raised questions as to why he did not try to involve the police immediately after her disappearance. Meanwhile, public attention to Sibora's case gradually faded, despite the efforts of her family. Marco, who remained in Spain, seemed to have adapted to life after her disappearance. To his neighbors, he looked like a friendly person who was into sports and communicated with those around him. However, his past ties to Sibora and complaints from his new partners continued to cast a shadow over his image. While Sibora's family hoped for at least some news, the investigation remained at a standstill. Law enforcement agencies began to expand the range of checks, including the use of international databases of missing persons. But even this did not bring results, and for Sibora's loved ones, uncertainty continued to be the most difficult ordeal. By 2023, Marco had managed to completely change his life. At first glance, he was living with a new partner named Paula, and they had a common child. However, behind the facade of this new life, the same problems lurked that had haunted him for many years. The relationship with Paula could not be called stable. She repeatedly told close people that she was subjected to physical violence by Marco. He, in turn, could not hold down a job, which only aggravated their situation. Working at a pizzeria, Marco met Victor Molina, the owner of the restaurant, who later offered a job to him and Paula. Victor also provided the couple with a small apartment for rent, hoping to ease their difficult financial situation. Unlike Marco, Paula quickly gained trust and respect at work. Victor and his sister Victoria, who also worked at the restaurant, became not only her employers, but also her support. Over time, Victoria learned more about the difficulties in Paula and Marco's relationship. After one incident, she began to openly advise Paula to go to the police. According to her, Marco became aggressive at work, and even at home he did not provide any support. Once, an incident occurred at the restaurant that became the last straw for Victor. The door to the employee's toilet was broken. Victoria learned from Paula that Marco had done it, accusing her of allegedly using this room for meetings with colleagues. After that, Marco was transferred to another place under Victor's supervision. Despite his hard work and attempts to create the impression of a normal life, Paula could not hide the difficulties of her situation. Her trust in Victoria allowed her to reveal more details of her life. She admitted that she continued to live with Marco only because it was the only way to regain custody of her children, whom the authorities had removed due to illegal substances found in the house. The substances belonged to Marco, but the consequences affected the whole family. For Paula, this became a personal tragedy. Her main goal was to save enough money to break ties with Marco and restore her rights to the children. Marco's situation, meanwhile, was deteriorating. He often complained to Victor about his difficult financial situation, claiming that he continued to work only for the sake of his family. However, neither his actions nor his behavior confirmed this. His aggression at work and inability to get along with colleagues led Victor to seriously doubt the feasibility of further cooperation with him. In parallel, Victoria, seeing how difficult Paula's situation was, continued to persuade her not to tolerate violence. Paula, fearing for her safety, preferred not to go into open conflict. She said that once Marco hit her 4 times and kicked her, but at the same time downplayed the severity of the incident. For Victoria and Victor, this was confirmation that her situation required intervention. On Tuesday, May 16, 2023, Paula spent her day off in a good mood, making plans for the evening. She shared with colleagues her intentions to relax, spend time calmly and usefully. The next day, May 17th, Victoria, her colleague and friend, expected to hear from Paula how her evening had gone. But events began to unfold differently. In the morning of May 17th, in the apartment that Paula shared with Marco, around 11:30, loud screams rang out. This was not uncommon. Quarrels between them occurred often, but this time everything sounded much more serious. Paula's voice was distinctly heard. She was calling for help. The screams sounded with such intensity that they were heard by Victor, the landlord of the apartment and Paula's employer, who was nearby. Together with another employee of the restaurant, he hurried to the scene. Approaching the door of the apartment, the men began to knock and loudly ask what was happening. From inside, faint sobs could be heard, which then stopped. A few seconds later, Marco opened the door. His voice was calm, and he assured that everything was fine. According to him, Paula had simply gone to bed and calmed down. However, her voice was no longer heard, which caused Victor to have serious suspicions. The situation was aggravated by the fact that, literally a few days ago, Marco had been fired by Victor from the restaurant after a series of incidents, including the disappearance of a kitchen knife. The dismissal was the last straw, as Victor no longer trusted Marco and wanted to avoid possible conflicts. But now, Marco found himself at the center of a new, disturbing incident. Meanwhile, Victor, with a key in his hands, returned and tried to get inside to find out what had happened. On the floor in one of the rooms lay Paula's body with numerous stab wounds. Her clothes were soaked in blood, and it became clear that death had occurred several hours ago. The police immediately called forensic experts to collect evidence, and also began to search for Marco, who by that time had managed to escape. Paula's body was sent for a forensic medical examination to establish the exact cause of death, and the operatives began searching for the suspect. Marco was detained a few hours later in one of the local cafes. He was calmly sitting at a table, as if nothing had happened, and did not resist arrest. On May 20th, 2023, 3 days after Paula's tragic murder, Marco appeared in court. He was charged with a crime committed against the backdrop of gender-based violence and was also ordered to undergo a psychiatric examination and testing for illegal drugs. The court ruled to keep him in custody without the right to bail. At the hearing, Marco exercised his right to remain silent except for answers to his lawyer's questions. There was no mention that day of Sibora's disappearance, which he had spoken about earlier. However, it was this name that was again in the spotlight. It turns out that even before the trial, on May 17th, the day of the crime, during interrogation at the police station, Marco unexpectedly stated that he wanted to make a confession related to a 9-year-old case. He said that during a quarrel with Sibora, he killed her and hid her body in the apartment where they lived together in 2014. Marco even offered to show the exact place where, according to him, the remains were located. Despite his confession, law enforcement officers decided to postpone their verification, focusing on the case of Paula's murder. For Sibora's mother, Elisabetta, the news of Marco's arrest and his confessions in her daughter's case was a new blow. For 9 years of uncertainty, she lost hope, but continued to wait for news about her daughter. Over these years, her life changed. Sibora's father died of illness, never knowing the truth about her fate, and Elisabetta's only joy was the birth of a grandson from her son. After the official confirmation of the identity of the remains, Elisabetta recalled how she had turned to the police, hoping that her daughter's case would be solved. Now, these efforts yielded results, but brought bitter relief. In parallel, experts continued to analyze the evidence found at the site of the remains. The knife found in the package was sent for forensic examination to search for biological traces that could point to Marco. At the same time, Spanish investigators interacted with their Italian colleagues to supplement the materials of the Sibora disappearance case. Simultaneously, the investigation into Paula's murder continued, where Marco was already the main suspect. Despite all the evidence, and despite the fact that Marcus himself confessed to the massacre of his ex-girlfriend, and even indicated the place of burial of the body, he subsequently refused to admit his guilt in Sibora's case. His lawyer insisted that his client's words about the location of the body were made under pressure and could not be used against him. However, the investigators believed that the evidence found in the box, including Sibora's personal belongings, was sufficient grounds for further charges. In January 2024, several months after the discovery of Sibora's remains, her family finally got the opportunity to see her off on her final journey. After the completion of forensic examinations, the body was handed over to relatives for burial. The ceremony took place in Italy, where Sibora's friends and loved ones were able to say goodbye to her. In her memory, balloons with messages were released into the sky, symbolizing hope and farewell. At that time, the main attention was focused on the court proceedings in Marco's case, who was accused of killing Paula. During the hearing on January 30th, 2024, he handed the court a handwritten letter, 17 pages long, in which he admitted his guilt in her death, but with numerous reservations. He claimed that the conflict between them occurred due to accumulated quarrels related to a €50 debt and his infidelity. According to Marco, during the argument he defended himself too strongly, which led to the tragedy. However, the investigation found that the wounds on Paula's body were on her back, which cast doubt on his words about self-defense. Despite the confession, Marco did not wish to speak in detail about Sibora's case. He only confirmed that he wrapped her body in bags, hid it in a wooden box, covered it with flowers, sprinkled it with lime, and walled it up. At the same time, he denied his involvement in her death and tried to justify his actions, calling them a consequence of fear of circumstances. During the trial, Marco suddenly changed his testimony regarding Sibora's death, offering a new version. He claimed that the cause of her death was the Albanian mafia, with which he was allegedly associated due to debts. According to him, he borrowed 25,000 euros to open a brothel, but the money was stolen. When he could not return the debt, 4 men came to his house, one of whom killed Sibora during an argument. Marco claimed that under the threat of his life, he was forced to get rid of the body in order to avoid further consequences. This version raised doubts among the investigators, since Marco had already changed his testimony before. During the investigation, it turned out that he used lies to confuse the investigators, starting from the moment of his arrest in May 2023 after Paula's murder. His claims about the mafia were also not confirmed. None of the collected evidence. The cause of Sibora's death was established after the autopsy. Numerous stab wounds, which, despite the condition of the body, clearly indicated the violent nature of the crime. Sibora's family received confirmation of her death years after she was declared missing. Elisabetta, her mother, said that for the last 9 years she lived with the hope of learning the truth, despite the fact that Sibora's father did not live to see this moment. By May 2024, the trial in Paula's case was ongoing. The court ruled to hold trials with the participation of a jury. The Sibora Gagani case, although reopened, had not yet gone to trial. Investigators continued to check Marco's statement, including his claim of mafia involvement. We await new trials. The story of Sibora Gagani and Paula underscores how destructive relationships built on violence and manipulation can lead to tragic consequences. Sibora, who dreamed of the future, and Paula, who tried to regain control of her life, both fell victim to the same person. Their fates show how important it is to recognize the signs of violence in a timely manner and intervene to prevent new tragedies. The stories of Sibora Gagani and Paula make us think about how the system fails time and time again when it comes to protecting women from domestic violence. After all the signs were there on the surface: threats, Marco's aggressive behavior, the desperate attempts of the victims to find help. But no one could or wanted to hear them. Now, let's take a deeper look at this problem. The scariest thing is that similar stories continue to repeat themselves. Abusers remain at large, and their victims are left alone with their fear. Paula couldn't leave Marco, afraid of losing her children, and instead of protecting the family from the aggressor, the Child Protection Services deprived the mother of her rights because of the drugs that belonged to Marco himself. Sibora tried to escape, even returning to Italy, but the system did not provide her with adequate protection, and she found herself trapped again. When we analyze this case, it becomes evident how deeply rooted the problems are in the system of protecting victims of domestic violence. Marco had a long history of aggressive behavior, problems with the law, and complaints from previous partners. But somehow, this information did not become a reason for serious intervention by law enforcement. He freely moved between countries, changed jobs, started new relationships, and no one tracked his behavior. It is especially shocking that even after Sibora's disappearance in 2014, when her mother raised the alarm and pointed to Marco's suspicious behavior, the investigation was conducted formally. No one paid proper attention to Marco's contradictory testimony about how Sibora allegedly left home. He first said that she left all her things, then claimed that he saw her with suitcases. And these obvious discrepancies somehow did not become a reason for a more thorough check. The social protection system also proved to be ineffective. Paula actually became a hostage of the situation. Without financial support, without a real opportunity to protect herself and her children, without hope that the state would take her side. She tried to save money to break out of the toxic relationship, but time was against her. And her work colleagues, who saw the bruises and heard her screams, could only offer moral support. It is also worth paying attention to how the police worked. When neighbors heard Paula's cries for help, and Victor came to check the situation, Marco simply said that everything was fine, and that turned out to be enough. No one insisted on seeing Paula herself, making sure she was safe. And a few hours later, it was too late. Now, looking back, we see how much could have been done differently. Create a unified database of individuals prone to domestic violence, with the ability to exchange information between countries. Provide real protection for those who dare to report violence, from emergency financial assistance to safe housing. Change the approach of law enforcement to checking reports of domestic violence. Make it more serious and systematic. It is also necessary to talk about psychological assistance, both for victims and their children. After all, women often return to abusers precisely because of a lack of support, because of the fear of being left alone, because of economic dependence, and children who witness violence need special attention and care so that this traumatic experience does not ruin their future. Sibora and Paula could have lived if society had not turned a blind eye to domestic violence, if law enforcement took reports of threats more seriously, if the state had created real protection mechanisms for those who dared to break out of toxic relationships, if neighbors, colleagues, casual witnesses were not afraid to intervene when they see signs of abuse. Unfortunately, we cannot bring Sibora and Paula back, but we can and must do everything to ensure that such tragedies do not happen again. If you witness domestic violence, do not be silent. One phone call can save someone's life. If you know someone who is suffering from violence, offer help, support, information about organizations that can protect them. This story is not just a criminal chronicle. It is a cry for help that everyone must hear. It is a call for changes in the system, in society, in our attitude to the problem of domestic violence. Because tomorrow, anyone could be in the place of Sibora or Paula, your sister, friend, daughter. And if this story has impressed you, subscribe to the Detective Brooks Stories channel. We talk about the most resonant criminal cases so that their lessons are not forgotten. We raise difficult topics and show the real problems of society that lie behind every crime. Together, we make this world a little safer. See you again on the Detective Brooks Stories channel.